Welcome to Live from Plato's Cave. I am Mario Veen. This is episode 36, The Natural Contract with Aldo Houterman. In Plato's allegory of the cave, the prisoners in the cave are in kind of a social contract. They speak to each other, they react to the shadows, they play shadow games, but they don't have a conscious relationship to, for instance, the cave wall or the fire behind them, let alone to the sun outside at the surface. So they're in a social contract, but they don't have a natural contract. In Michel Serres' book, The Natural Contract, he opens with a painting by Goya of two duelists who are fighting each other with swords. But these duelists are in a deep swamp, and the more they fight, the more they sink into the mud, until they can't fight anymore, and both perish. So, in this case, the mud becomes their common enemy. In conversations, in arguments and debates, we tend to focus on three elements. The first two elements are the opponents, the debaters, the two opposing viewpoints. So in Goya's paintings, these are the duelists, and often these are the only two elements that we focus on. But a third element is what Serres calls their mutual friend. So in order to engage in any discussion or conversation or debate or even a fight, there need to be some common language, some rules, some laws. You cannot win an argument with someone if you don't speak the same language. And Serres points out that even wars start with a declaration of war, which is also a kind of contract. So the third element are the kinds of rules that we spoke about in episode 25 about conversation analysis with Mike Huiskes. Patterns of who gets to speak when and what kind of things they are allowed to say, what kind of things make sense, and which words or sentences or topics are taboo. Or you can think of the law, like in previous episode with Jessica den Outer. Who gets to build what where? Who has the right to speak in court? Who does not? But all of these elements, all of these networks, they constitute our social contract. The way humans speak together, the way we solve things or don't solve things, the way we engage in social interaction, the way we build our societies. And traditionally, these three elements are the only ones that count in our society, in politics, in law, and even in science. For instance, we speak about human rights as if human is the only thing that counts. So Serres points out that there's a fourth conversation partner, which he calls the mutual enemy. That's the mud in Goya's painting. And this mud is not just a stage on which they fight, but it's part of the fight itself. Imagine you're walking together with someone and you're having a good conversation and you're walking in the forest and suddenly there's a thunderstorm. You can't understand each other anymore. Maybe you have to shift your priorities. So since we are at war with the world itself, and we have been for several decades, that's a fight that we cannot win. And that's why we also need to have kind of peace with the world and a contract with the world, which is a natural contract. Our mountain guide today is Aldo Houterman. Aldo teaches medical ethics and philosophy at the Amsterdam University Medical Center and is doing his PhD at the ESPRIT Center for Sports, Integrity and Transition at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. His book, We Are Our Body, is about the meaning of the body, sports and movement for human existence. This time we're not sitting in kind of a fishbowl in a cafe in Rotterdam, but I'm sitting in a hotel in Maastricht. And where are you?
Yeah, I'm at home in Amsterdam.
So we're talking over Zoom. Previous time that we talked, you recommended me to read the book The Natural Contract, and I'm very happy to discuss it with you.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say it's overwhelming.
Yeah? Okay, can I ask why it's overwhelming? Maybe some hint for the listener.
All right, yeah. Well, first of all, the book was written in 1990, but it could have been written this year about the climate crisis and about our relationship to nature, our relationship to each other. That's one part. The other part is that I've just read half of the book in the last day. Mm-hmm. And in the previous 2 months, I've just been reading the first 30 pages because they're there are so many ideas in there.
Yeah.
And every idea that you find connects to many other things that at least I'm working on.
Oh, great.
There's a lot of philosophers and they kind of tell you their system. They invite you into their world and you have to kind of know their system, but you have to come to their world.
Yeah.
With Serres, I have the feeling that he's coming into my world.
Mm-hmm.
The world of my everyday life, the world of my professional life, and he's explaining my world to me, and he's saying, well, actually, this is how you can see that, and this is how you can see that. So it means that if I'm reading a page, I'm reading 2 sentences, and I'm thinking about them for like 2 days.
Yeah.
So that's why it's very overwhelming.
Oh, great. So about your points, so the second point, indeed, I'd like to think of Serres as a sort of experimental philosopher. So he's developing ideas. He's not completely working them out, but there are a lot of ideas in his work that you can pick up and you can work out for yourself. And about the first point, so that it is written in 1990, right? So that is that is already so early. So about climate change and about laws of nature. So this can also be a bit of disappointing because we have already this book for 30 years and it hasn't changed much in climate politics. Yeah, so you see some influences but yeah, the problems are now even more far bigger than 33 years ago. So, but that's so. There's a lot of. So I read an interview with Serres yesterday. So it's in his interview book, Pantopie, and so why he was writing the book. So he that's maybe interesting to explain because he was asked by the French government actually in the 1980s. To be a representative at the G7 of France or the the Socialist Party in France, to say something and to discuss with other countries in the G7 about climate and the world. And one of his ideas there was when discussing with, for example, Japan or Russia or China, for example, it wasn't. It was very difficult to find a common moral or a common ethics between the countries to deal with the world. So there are a lot of. So he says that how you should think about individuality or or what are collectives. That differs very much from which country you are. So he was. Thinking, so moral wouldn't work here, but we have to find a sort of law or a contract, so between the countries. So that is why he began to study law, and he was taking courses law again, and so with the students he was sort of trying to get a grip on how can we think about law, what is it, what law does, and how can we think about laws of nature? And also an interesting quote that he gives that he had a dinner with Boutros Ghali that was the former Secretary General of the United Nations. And before he was Secretary General, he met Serres at a restaurant, and Serres was asking, so you have representatives at the United Nations from all kinds of countries, from Brazil, from Japan, for example. But
I have a feeling what he's going to ask.
yeah. Where are the representatives of the earth, of the fire, of the air, and of life, for example? And he said, so that's not what the United Nations are about. So it's international, but. So that was a bit of disappointment for Serres, and that was what he was trying to discuss also to make it more global instead of international.
Yeah, that's a good point to emphasize, because that gives listeners an idea of kind of the essence of the book is that the United Nations, well, now of course we have the climate conferences, but there it was also very early with the Kyoto Protocol and everything. So you can see a room full of government leaders, and we know this image, right? So there's the image of the government leaders, the people in power in the world, they're sitting inside and they're talking amongst each other, and they're talking about what can we do to kind of survive on the world. But there is no, the trees are not there, the lakes are not there, there is no one speaking up for the animals or for the
Yeah. So, and that really, this topic really then fits in his line of thought. So he wrote already a book on water, for example, in 1977, Michel Serres. So about turbulence and of the flux of water, and he also wrote a book on fire, on the thermodynamics, for example. So that was really. So it's not only a natural science perspective, but also a sort of philosophical perspective of writing about the elements, for example, and that they really, take part into our thinking, into our conduct, for example. So how we deal with material, and how should we think of objects, for example. So that is so in his work in the 1960s and 70s, there's a lot of reflection on how, on scientific models, for example, of how should we model a kind of object, and how can we think of a kind of objects. And so normally the object is thought of as a solid body, so that we can grasp, for example. And so, but he gives counter examples. So, for example, like a river or a flame, for example, so that we can study these as objects, but they're not prototypical objects. So you have not only solid objects, but you have also liquids, for example, you have gases, and so we have to think about these also as objects. So when we think about objects, not only as graspable, but but also as overwhelming, for example. And so that there's a really philosophy of objectivity in his work, and for him this is far more interesting than so what he know from France and from Paris is that the philosophy of subjectivity, right? So that it is the philosophy of existence, for example. So that the world is grounded in our experience, for example. But in Serres you find it really good reflection, broad reflection on technical objects, on objects of nature. So the idea of a contract of nature really fits into his work, I would say, yeah.
And again, just the topic of water. Did you happen to watch the news or Nieuwsuur yesterday?
Yes, yeah.
Because there was a big topic about water, because in the Netherlands, there's a big problem with water. Well, there are many problems with water because it's very polluted, and the news item was about that we're not going to make the EU objectives for clean water. And one of the things is that basically we're polluting and poisoning our water, because a lot of our drinking water comes from rivers, but factories are also poisoning the rivers. So then the water companies have to filter the water, and before they only had to filter it once or twice. Now they have to already filter it 4 times. And there's a big problem because on the one hand we have water can be like, so Sarah has this image where, sometimes you're having a conversation amongst each other, but the world can make itself heard in such a way that any conversation becomes impossible. So we already had some floods like in Limburg and Germany, which just completely disrupt society. But at the same time, we're also now worried about droughts, and we're seeing already in Spain and in France. So the water is, on the one hand, there's too much water or too little, or the water is polluted. And add into that we're also like a seafaring nation. The oceans are heating up, which is also, so it's very interesting to think about what is this water. And obviously, I mean, if there's one thing we can say is that the way that we are relating to water, our contract with water is at the moment not helping, and it's in such a way that it's threatening our very existence as a country, at least in the Netherlands.
Yeah. All right. So interesting. Yeah. So also, I had to think of René ten Bos' book Water, So that's he also writes about Serres in that, but he talks about water also. So how we deal with water is that you have in the modernity, you have, for example, Hugo de Groot, I think, so he develops the laws of open sea, so that water is actually a lawless place, except for the ocean, for example. And then so it's actually it's kind of anarchistic idea, but it's also gives us the so the possibility to dump so to pollute it, for example, and leave it to the rest of what we should do with the water, and also to fish out of the water, because it is a lawless place. There is no so it can also pollute the water in that way. So that gives us I think a sort of interesting idea. So that on the one hand, water is lawless, so it can also be dangerous for people, for example. So we have to build dams, for example, to not get into contact with water very much, but also so the idea of polluting the same water, right? So that we take our things from the water, the fish for to eat, for example. But yeah.
And as you know, the previous episode I spoke with Jessica den Outer, and she is involved in groups that are trying to make the Waddenzee in the Netherlands a legal person, and make it's actually perfect. I'm in Maastricht because this is where the Maas is flowing.
Yeah.
And so she's trying to make the Maas also give rights to the Maas, like the Maas has the right to flow. So is this kind of an example of what Serres would call a natural contract?
It's one. So I think so. The giving rights to nature, to non-human persons of law. So I would say that would be an instance of what Serres would think of the natural contract. But I think it's more broader than only that idea. So giving legal status to objects of nature, that would really fit beautifully into his contract. And he has a kind of argumentation for that in the ideas of social contract, for example, that you find in modernity, for example, with thinkers of Hobbes and Rousseau. The nature is suppressed. And so it's and you have also this idea of natural law, but then the natural is supposed to be concerning humans, right? So we have natural rights, for example, by birth or by having reason, for example. And then the meaning of natural is becoming completely humanized or anthropomorphized. But I think there's something more to say about Serres, because he is always in his book, it's also about science. So it's a reflection of how can we gather knowledge without polluting, for example, without destroying or destructing the world. And so the idea of Serres is that modernity, so since Descartes and Bacon, for example, nature, we have to be masters and possessions of nature, and without acknowledging that when we do that, nature is transforming itself. So the nature is changing at the same time when we consider nature as something to be possessed. So that we can see now, for example, in the global heating, for example, so that and so that there's something more to say. So it's also about science. How should we gather knowledge? And Serres is a philosopher of science, so he's really think we should use knowledge or gather knowledge about nature, about climate, about ecosystems, for example, but without without polluting it, without destructing it, for example.
I have one example about, in case people are wondering, what do you mean science is polluting? Well, one example is the healthcare industry. So obviously the healthcare industry with the medication and the pharmaceutics and everything, and the hospitals and the surgeries, it's brilliant because we get to live longer and healthier lives. So it's adding to the health of people. But at the same time, if the healthcare industry globally would be a country, it would be in the top 5 of most polluting countries. So, for instance, in the Netherlands, the healthcare industry is responsible for about 7% of CO2 emissions. So healthcare is a form of science, and it we get knowledge that we can use for our advantage and our society, but it's also a big part of the problem because it's surgery is one of the most polluting things for the world that you can have.
Yeah. That's I understand, and I think a third aspect, very interesting and important aspect, is that is in his book. So not only the political law, for example, or political negotiation about nature and the scientific knowledge about nature, but also sort of physical education that you find in his work. So that it is a sort of we have lost contact with the world. So that's basically a bit of idea that you find a lot of places in his work. So that we only are interested in social constructions, for example, in logics, in language, and in text, for example, and therefore, and we have gathered ourselves in cities, and therefore we have a sort of a cosmic philosophy. So not only between philosophers, but between everyone. So that decisions are made about nature in boardrooms, for
one of the most brilliant sentences is in the book is the essentials take place indoors and with words instead of outside and with things.
Absolutely, yeah. So the idea is that negotiation would then take place only in the boardroom, for example, or in the court. But so this idea of physical education that Serres has is that negotiation always takes place. It's also when we climb mountains, for example, then we have a sort of negotiation with the mountain. And also when I cycle, for example, beneath Amsterdam, then there's also a negotiation between me and the wind, for example, and the canal.
The wind can help you if the wind is in your back. The wind can help you. It's like your friend, and when it's in the front, it's maybe not your enemy, but maybe it's like your sparring partner, your training, because you get, if you cycle, if you ascend the mountain, you also get stronger. So that's what you want, right? You don't want to just go downhill. So it's like this dialogue with you and the wind, and with you and the mountain when you cycle.
Yeah, and that is about So it's about. Also, the contract with nature, you would also really think it in terms of opening up your senses. That's so opening up senses to the world, get a grip, or how the world is structured, for example, what kind of patterns and how old the world is already, for example. So learning to listen, learning to see, learning to feel, that would be really important, mainly the most important part of the contract with nature, I think.
Yeah, which connects to Marcia Björnhout's concept of timefulness, which we also discussed a few times on the podcast. So she's a geologist. But a geologist always goes outside, to the mountain, looking at the rocks and everything. But I imagine that a mountain climber also kind of gets an idea of this, because you relate yourself to the mountain, but this mountain is so old and so you get this, not just like an idea. Of course, we can say mountains are, I don't know, this many millions years old, but it's a different way if you are actually there, with the mountain. And I thought maybe this is a good time before we go on to bring in some images, because I think there's several images that we could use, and that Serres also uses, and that kind of expresses different ways of like social contracts and contracts with nature.
Yeah.
So I'll just list the images first, and then we can just go on. So he opens the book with one image, and he kind of closes the book with another. So he opens the book with a painting from Goya. I think it's called The Duelists, but I'm not sure. It's two men who are dueling, who are fighting together, but they're in a swamp. So the harder they fight, the more they sink into the swamp.
Yeah.
So this is the first image. The one that he closes the book is the one, we just kind of discussed this. A group of mountain climbers, they're packing their gear, they're walking to the mountain, and the first stage, they can just walk. They're a group, but they're not connected. But when things get more difficult, they start to connect each other with cords, and they become a climbing party, so they're all connected. And when it even gets more difficult, they also attach their rope to the mountain. So there's always, the people are always connected. So if one of them falls, the other one can hold them, but also the mountain holds them as well, because if they fall, they're connected to the mountain. The third image, also having to do with mountain, is also something that was in the news this week about a Swiss village in a valley. But because of climate change, the glacier has been melting, and now there's a huge, how do you say that, rock? Very big one that is about to fall down. There's a risk that it falls down and it will crush the village. So because of climate change, there can be the village can be destroyed, but actually we don't know when. Actually, we could say when the tipping point will be reached, because once the tipping point is reached, the rock will roll down the mountain. There's nothing you can do to stop it, and the village will be destroyed. And then the fourth and final image relates to what you just said about going inside and outside. So Jessica we discussed it in the last episode. She was involved in a project in the Amstel Park because people are trying to find out, we want to give nature a voice, but how do you do that? So they're kind of doing experiments with that. And this experiment was in the Amstel Park in Amsterdam. And there's an image of Jessica in, I don't know what it's called in English. Like in Dutch, you say toga, like what? A rope, I think, a lawyer rope or something. And because she's the lawyer of a tree. But the interesting thing is in this image, you see her in the tree, and she's kind of, I guess, making the case for the tree. But what's interesting for me about this image is that the normal courtroom images are always inside, and the defendant is there in the court. But because the tree, you cannot take the tree into court, at least without violating its rights. So the courtroom has to go outside in order to be able to have a lawsuit with trees involved.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
But I have the feeling that you connect because you're interested in sports. Yeah. That you connect mostly to maybe like the first image with the duelist is kind of more martial arts.
It's also boxing,
boxing, and the other image is about the mountain climbers going into there.
Yeah. So the first image is the most important. So that's also the cover of the French book. So the duelists of Goya, and I always thought of it as Cain and Abel from the Bible. Yeah. So they were the brothers who were fighting against each other because one of them is jealous, for example. But so here the idea is that this is a very it's a multi-layered image, and also it's very important for Serres to give a sort of idea how do we model communication, or how do we model collectivity, for example. So normally, and this is also what he sees in, for example, philosophers of Plato and Hegel. So then the emphasis is between persons is on dialectics. So there's one straight line between two persons, for example, and they learn from each other, so they battle, so to say, in each other. For example, in Platonic dialogue, that's what Serres is also referring to that one wins, for example. So one has right and the other not, for example. So then so it's not about just, it's very it's only one line. So and Serres has this philosophy of the network, so that he develops. And so then you can think about, all right, so it's only one line but the world consists of multiple lines. For example, you can also take the detour, for example, to have a conversation. So he really universalizes this. So he multiplies these lines between persons, for example. And he thinks that this is really the model of dialectics is a warlike model of thinking about communication. So actually, when he introduces this model of dialectics, he's also saying, no, but there's another person as well. So when two people are speaking to each other, when they communicate, they are all both fighting against a third person, which according to Serres is noise. So for example, we are now in communication via the Zoom channel, for example. So we are both trying to overcome or suppress this noise of the Zoom channel. So we suppose that the Zoom channel is not there, so that we can speak to each other. And you find this model in this picture of Goya as well. So when the brothers or the two persons are fighting against each other, so it's unilinear, really directed about beating the other. Without thinking that there are other things as well. For example, the quicksand. For example,
when you're in a fight, you forget the world. We all know these people. Actually, I heard. I was at breakfast here with some colleagues, and one of them was telling, I couldn't sleep because next door to me was a fighting couple. Mm-hmm. So the couple is fighting and keeping everyone awake. But they're so in their fight, they don't realize that they're keeping people up.
Yes, absolutely. So what Sarah is then saying is that we are really focused about subjectivity on subjects here that are fighting against each other, and we are sort of addicted to the question who is going to win. And thereby forgetting so that the constitution or the process that subjects can even come into being, for example, that they need a world or materiality, so to fight to be able to fight, for example. So so in their fights they suppress nature, their objectivity, really. So they are only directed against each other, and they suppress then their own constituents, and their own horizon, for example. So that's then the excluded third, according to Serres.
Yeah, and there's also a fourth that professionally I've been most interested in, which is that if you have a duel, there are also rules. And I mean, this was one of so just to finish that thought, so I'm interested in the rules of conversations and dialogue, and even without the world. I've been thinking about, when it comes to climate, you have this graph of the planet heating up and all the climate conferences on there. And and of course, the message it communicates is that the climate conferences, we've had like 26 now, I think, or 27, they don't make any difference. So people are talking, as Greta Thunberg says, blah, blah, blah. But it's nothing happening. So one of the things I'm interested in is how can we have conversations, what kind of rules of conversations, what kind of dialogues would lead to action. So this is like, so in a duel you have rules, in a debate you have rules, and one of the most fascinating things that he opens the book with is, because you mentioned Hobbes already. So Hobbes has this say, the natural state is like war of everyone against everyone. But then Serres says conflict is violence plus a contract. So a war starts with a contract.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a common contract against nature. So then so it's already filters out some. So it's not a war of everyone against everyone. So there's so a war that it goes together with a sort of declaration of war. So we are now into fight with each other, for example, and so this according to Serres, this is already a contract between the dualists. So and this is one of the main constituents of what would later be a law, for example, formalized law, that we suppress certain things to have a battle or to have a certain debate against each other. And so there's not, so the original state, which is is more like in Serres, not the war between persons, but more like a sort of violence against the world or something like that, and the world that we try to suppress with that in order to win from our competitor, for example.
Yeah, and he refers to the battlefield. Once the war is over, the battlefield is destroyed. Let's say maybe forests are burned down. So wars have a huge impact on the environment. Yeah. And actually also maybe this is a form of like a twisted natural contract, because for instance in Afghanistan the Taliban strategically used droughts, water shortages in their war, the control of water flow, like making a dam and protecting a dam or blowing up a dam. So the world and destroying the world is also very much part of wars already. And well, in the Netherlands we have this example where maybe you probably know more about this than me, where the Spanish came and they flooded the water. So they opened the sluizen, sluices.
The dikes,
the dikes. But so this is not quite what you're saying. What you're saying is more like so we have this natural contract. It's like almost like the couple fighting. Yeah. They're trying to solve something, but they're suppressing actually that they're also disturbing my sleep, which has an impact on what I have to do the next day or something. But in this case, it's more like the world. So the healthcare industry is focusing on the social contract that we have to, keep people healthy and everything like that. But then we kind of forget that there's also a world in which this happens, and that this can be very, destructive for the world.
Yeah, and it's a very difficult argument, I think. So we feel, so personally I feel sympathy for Ukraine, for example, or to patients in your example. So that so the idea that on focusing on the social contract is a very it's a very hard one, I think. So to include this third person as well, so the world of the objects, I would say, because then it seems that you're suppressing, for example, or you don't take it up for Ukraine or Zelensky, for example, and then you're a supporter or sort of supporter with Putin, for example. But that. I think that's a tough argument. So to reflect on the social contract that war is, because we have to we think then we sympathize with the enemy, but it's not sympathizing with the enemy. It's sympathizing with with nature, so to say. Yeah.
One question I have for you is, because he opens this book and it's very powerful, and the idea that actually conflict requires a contract. While you could say, outside of the social contract, it's war of all against all, and he's saying no, actually, war starts with the social contract. What I'm wondering is why he uses this. He's emphasizing war and violence and conflict. to explain like this like a contract. But he could also have taken, for instance, a marriage contract where you you marry each other and you promise each other loyalty and in sickness and in health. So why does he use like the paradigm of violence rather than the paradigm of love and marriage?
Yeah, great. So that's a great. So in his metaphysics, or so in this idea of objects, so the noise is very, very important. So there's so think about as all. The second law of thermodynamics is that all systems tends to disintegrate, and also about the so for example in quantum mechanics it's so elements or the quantum fluxes are non-determinate. So an agreement or a law, for example, that would be an exception to the rule that the world is chaotic. In Serres terms, it's more the rational contract would be an exception of all sorts of patterns of nature, and patterns always flux, always deviate from their law, and they also have a sort of in themselves a sort of violence. So they make a sort of noises. So agreement between different constituents, between different objects would be really an example of an exception of what nature is for Serres. So there are a lot of things that wouldn't fall into the category of the rational, into the category of the observable, for example, and it is far more. So he says there's a vast sea of entropy, and there's only small islands of the living, for example. So there's a vast sea of depth also in his anthropology. So, for example, cities are constituted of graves, for example. So there's so he thinks maybe it can be somehow bit of pessimistic about that sort of primal violence of not only of people but also of animals and of things themselves. But we have this possibility of law, for example, of getting agreements, and this would turn this violence into a sort of he would say this as negentropy, as a sort of way of symbiosis, of living together. So it's not. So maybe it can be the primal state, but it can also be turned around. So we have other states as well. So for example, we can protect wildlife, for example, and not allowing violence to
right.
end.
So I think there's something in I don't know if this is in the Geneva Conventions or something like that, but I think there is some kind of agreement in war that you protect cultural heritage.
Yeah.
So this could be maybe an example of, or there's let's say in war, there's also an agreement sometimes about, let's say, passing the war and having a humanitarian corridor and the Red Cross. So there's there's a war of two, let's say, nations that want to destroy each other, but at the same time they also have a contract about, okay, but these we do not torture, or we protect an ancient site, or we it's in our mutual interest that we can take care of the wounded, or that we exchange, let's say, prisoners of war.
So great. So so the origin of contracts, for example, is to limit parasitism. So there's always parasitism. So we only also animals, and for example, physics parasitizes on us by the second law of thermodynamics, for example, and you have, so we parasitize on nature by having clothes, for example, eating food, for example, but also nature. So he has, in other books, he has the example of farms, for example. Then there's a sort of agreement between the animals of the farm, between the plants and the people. So there's this sort of common agreement of living together, and so it's actually to limit parasitism, according to Serres, that one is taking all of it.
We don't have to spend time on this because it's a big question that is not explicitly in the book. But the reason this interests me, so the reason, like, why do you choose a war as a paradigm rather than, for instance, marriage contract, is that for me, so a marriage contract is an example. I mean, ideally, it's an example of unconditional love, where you would say, even if you get sick, even if, if you, no matter what happens, I will take care of you. And it's like also the kind of the contract between a mother and a child. And if I think about, for myself, if I think about my relationship to the earth, I mean, I'm mostly, there are different ways, like, this is also the question that Sarah says, like, we have to learn how to relate to the whole of the earth. And that's something that is like a challenge. So how do you characterize your relationship to the earth? And for me, the most obvious one is mother. So Mother Earth, because the earth provides for us. It doesn't, it takes a lot of our shit, like we're in puberty, and it's understand everything like that. It's very friendly environment. So that's why the question interests me.
Yeah, interesting. So, it's always that's it also in this book on the parasite. So that, for example, the unconditional love would be it would be an exceptional state of nature. So that would be, so for example, a baby is a parasite of his mother, or a fetus, for example. So there is no, so the first act is parasitism, actually. So that's right. Anthropology.
But the baby also takes care. So if we continue the thing, so now, of course, in our society it's a bit different, but one of the ways that you have children is that they can take care of you when you are sick and old, but also it gives your life purpose, because so as I shared in previous episodes, like, one of the reasons why I'm so busy with the climate crisis is because I'm thinking about my 5-year-old daughter and the world she grows up in. So I relate to a world like several generations in the future, and that is a different, like, timefulness and way of relating to the world and to time. That is So I think also that is one of his optimistic ideas, is that we can change from this sort of parasitic behavior to another type. All right, let's talk about that, because I'm ready for some optimistic. So if this is the first, this is kind of his diagnosis, right? This is right now what's going on with the social contract and the way we kind of suppress nature. So where does he want us to go? What is because we need a paradigm shift. And what does this paradigm shift look like?
So normally in ecology, for example, you would think of so questions would then be, so how would we reduce emission, for example, or how do we save the planet? And so this is more like Sarah's idea is that, so we take it more broader and more like a sort of philosophical idea. So how can we think about nature? How is nature changing while we as ourselves is changing? So he's also asking the question, so why do we pollute, for example? So what do we really want when we dirty the world? So these are interesting questions that he asks in the book. And who are we actually to seek to think ecologically? So who is humanity itself? And that's a very that's a very important question in his work. So to think of a sort of humanity, and a sort of humanity that is changing as itself as well. It's changing with the world. So his idea is that in the 20th century, there are a lot of there's a different conception of humanity. So there are a lot of changes going on, and this transforms our humanity for him. So the idea is that we have left the Neolithic. So we have left the farms. So for example, in France, for example, at the beginning in 1900, I think that there's almost 80% was farmer, and in 2000s it's only 4%. So there's also a sort of urbanization going on. People leaving the countryside, living in cities,
living inside as well, indoors. So we moved from living outdoors to living indoors.
Yeah, living longer, dependent on medicine, for example. And so it's more like, so we have lost our contract, so to say, that we had as farmers to the countryside, and that would also be interesting in the farmers' protest, because farmers would indeed say, why you city dwellers, right? So who are you to talk about how to deal with nature, for example? So it's actually that you didn't want to live with nature anymore. That would be an argument there. So the ideas of Serres is that there are this is a metamorphosis of humanity. So we have to rethink what humanity consists of, and therefore what our relationship is with the planet. And another important.
So sorry to pause you, but if I understand correctly, it means that he's saying that before we didn't really have to think about this because it was in our face. So know that if you don't take care of your livestock, you're not going to eat. So it's like a mutual dependency. So you have to make sure that they're kind of healthy and everything.
Yeah.
But now we didn't have to think about it, but now we have to start to think about that because we changed it.
Absolutely. So, and then nature was considered as your plot of land, for example. So it was limited idea of nature.
A garden or a plot of land.
So or the forest in your neighborhood, for example. And so, for example, since 1969, then you have this picture of the Earth as a sort of marble into space. Right, so that really changes our idea of nature. So the nature is then, we cannot consider it as a milieu, for example, or as an environment for people to live, or as a sort of horizon, or a sort of ground that we take for granted. But it has become a concrete object. It has become an object. So that this marble, the Earth, that's is subject to all kind of behavior, for example, so subject to pollution, for example, and so not only the space travelers see that, but we have ever since that picture and this kind of image, we have all become space travelers in the sense that so we now have a sort of idea what globality is, right? So that we live on the same planet, for example, and that we have to to manage to synchronize our lifestyle to that planet. And so the Serres, somewhat provokingly, he always says, so now the idea of nature is coming up, right? So that after that we know that the Earth is in crisis, for example. So then you see an idea. So we have to have laws that or sort of contract that works globally.
Right. So that relate to the planet as a whole. So one of the things in the rights of nature movement is saying that, so even narrowing it down, so there are laws for specific parts of the river, and I'm responsible for this part, and I'm a factory and I can pollute the river, but you're actually downstream, too bad for you, and also the drinking water companies. So the same, so we're dividing the river in two parts, one in which we can put poison in the river, and the other part in which we drink the river. And in the rights of nature movement, they're saying, well, but the the river is a whole, one holistic entity. But Jessica also said, yes, but this is a good step, but this is not the solution. So we can fight for the rights of the Waddenzee and the rights of the Maas, but and the Veluwe. But what you really need, and I think this is in Ecuador happening, is like a recognition of the rights of the planet as a whole. So not just chopping things up in parts and dividing them, but relating to a holistic entity of which we are also part.
Great. That's so. The planet as a whole. So as a globalized humanity, that's how Sarah frames it, right? So that we are part of a sort of also a partnership with the world, so that humanity, that is sort of a partner with and both react to each other. So that's the idea, and so the law, therefore the contract of nature, shouldn't parasite on the planet, for example. So it should limit the parasitism of the planet. But before we have law, there are a lot of other things of ways of thinking about collectivity and collective action that concerns the planet. So, for example, he has this idea of the court, for example, right, in mountain climbing, so that the law is actually so. For example, that is the message of mountain climbing is that we can only climb dependent, and we are dependent on the court that is relating us to each other.
If it's you could to some extent you can climb alone, but when things get very difficult, you need this climbing party. And what fascinates me about this is that he's saying, well, maybe the court was the first, let's say, tool, and he's relating also court to attachment and attachment to contract. But at the same time, so I'm really interested in Bernard Stiegler. I don't know if Stiegler related to Sarah. I can ask Daniel Ross because we're having another episode. But Stiegler is really focusing on the flint was the first kind of the first tool. So the flint, like a stain bell. So like a sharp object, like a knife of a stone. And I think it's fascinating. That's one of the ideas that I am like exploring, is like, what does it mean if you say what for instance, Heidegger uses always the hammer. If you think about an example, paradigmatic example of a tool, you think about the hammer, but the hammer is there to smash things, kind of do violence, right? Exert force. But what if you think about the paradigmatic example of a cord, like a cord that connects mountain climbers, a cord that can make a gate, a cord can do many different things that a hammer cannot do.
So this also has to do with Serres' philosophy of technology and his reaction to sort of pragmatic idea of that technology serves as a pragmatic tool as an extension of organs, for example, like the hammer for a fist, and then the knife for our teeth, for example.
Well, that's very close to Stiegler as well. That technology is an extension of our humanity in a way, and we're also technological beings from the very start.
But Serres so he takes this into account, and he says this is very important in understanding technology, but he is also interested in sort of neutral technology. So, for example, that would be that technology is become independent of subject. So, for example, he mentions the nuclear bomb, for example, but also also the internet, for example. So their technology, once started with extensions of human organs, but it has an independent development of itself, and this is what he calls exo-Darwinism. So the Darwinism is not between species anymore, but between technological objects. And so they have a sort of competition or what kind of object we take into account and what kind of object we use. But he said it's never. So he's not always pessimistic about this, but because he thinks of the laptop and the mobile phone as a sort of object that you can not use for one particular job, for example, cutting or hammering, but you can use it for everything. So you can use it for making music, texting, and this is also relates, I think, to the cord. So that is also, a cord is something, it's a technological object that you can use for multiple things, and therefore we should really think, how can we use these kind of technological objects for limiting parasitism, for example, or connecting each other to each other and towards the world. So and this is kind of a sort of optimistic idea, I think, that you find also in this way of thinking about technology. Yeah,
I was thinking about this. I heard it in a commercial somewhere. There's like, one of the things that we need to do is we need to rewild nature, rewild gardens, for instance. So one of the things that anyone can do if they want to contribute to the solution for the climate crisis is, if you have a garden, kind of rewild it, also for the bees and everything. So you have the lawn, like a field, is like, it's only grass. There's nothing else on there. That's, we think this is aesthetically very beautiful, but it's also a kind of a contract with nature where you say only one species has the right to exist and not the others. But now you have this, and you have these automatic lawn mowers, like robot mowers. I don't know, but you could say from a technological perspective, these are maybe like the example of how automatically nature is being suppressed and technology is doing violence to nature. But now you have this lawnmower, and you can program it that it, for instance, keeps 19% of the lawn wild. So it's advertised in a way that you can say, well, we now know it's important for insect and bees and other plants to go there. So, but we also acknowledge that you kind of want your children to play on the lawn. So maybe this is kind of like a codification of a natural contract where you say, well, you mow the lawn automatically, but you also make sure that there is space for nature to exist kind of in its own right.
Yeah. It's a funny example, yeah.
Sorry, but I don't mean to get you off track, because we were talking about, what does he look, what is the solution, and what is the why is this mountain climbing party so important to him? And also, how do you, because you also have a different entry point from the perspective of sports philosophy. So how do you see this mountain climbing party from your perspective?
It was very important, so to say things about sports. So Serres was a mountain climber himself, and so it was also from the Dutch government, and so institution is what is the value of sports, for example. Normally it has an economic value, or it's a value for health, for example. And nowadays, and also with the colleagues I'm working on, it's also is sort of getting ideas, so opening up the senses, for example, and getting into contact with nature. These are so not in policy, these are taken into account of, but for example, in the theories that I read and that I discussed with my colleagues, it's becoming more and more important. So that it's also, sport is a way of reprogramming our contract with nature. So rewriting our contract with nature. And this is a bit of idealistic, but I think there's really some truth to that, so that we learn how to deal with complex situations. We learn how to deal with dissolution, with destruction, for example. We learn how to deal with violence within sports, and with a sort of also with a sort of freedom. So it's not only, so we have to our conduct is determined by a certain law, so we have to follow a certain law, but within developing techniques, so for example, holding the ball, for example, or passing or grasping the rock, you develop certain techniques, and there's also a sort of freedom, element of freedom in dealing with the world. So a lot of what I think interesting is in Serres here is also that climate policy is not only law-like. So it's it's not only that we should that the laws becoming more and more strict, and that we should follow them. So in certain cases that would certainly be needed. But he also says so of this line that it's not always, the contract is not always a straight line. It also has curves into it, for example. And it can also be loose, this kind of bond that we have, for example, that gives us some kind of space to improvise, and that always also is improvising on what the planet itself is doing, what the data themselves say. So there's always a kind of renegotiation with the planet, a kind of rewriting, reprogramming our contact with the planet. And in this case, I see some interesting relationships with sports and physical education. For example, that depends also on what your view on sports is. So Formula One would be would be a problematic case of sports.
Yeah. But, or going like fitness, because you're going indoors. Yeah. Nature is excluded, and you're training with weights that you can say, well, today I'm lifting 50 kilo. Yeah. While if you are, I don't know what would be an equivalent of mountain climbing, of course, rock climbing especially. You need to do if you need to hold, you need to hold. I mean, you're not going to let go. So one time you need a lot of strength, another time you need a lot of agility. Yeah. But you also have, so one connection I make is also mountain climbing is very creative, because there are always different pathways you can go. So it's not only like a sport, you try to make the conditions very rigid and controlled. So you can compete with each other, because you have to be, so the equivalent would be a climbing wall. So in a climbing wall, you place the holds, the footholds and the handholds in certain patterns, because you want to see who can best climb this wall. But when you have a mountain, there are no, you decide where the climbing wall, the holds are. But at the same time, the mountain also decides, like, maybe you take this hold and you lift your weight on it, and it breaks. And of course, in a climbing gym, you don't want that, because but also when I'm climbing in a gym, I know I can hang on this hold, because it will never break. But when I'm outside climbing, I have to always test that, kind of have a dialogue. So rather than just putting my weight fully onto this hold, I always test it first, and I look a little bit. So that's kind of more a dialogue.
So, this is also his view of the body, right? So that his aim is not to develop or to imitate one particular image of the body. So, for example, the muscled body that we know from the statues, for example, that we so that would be the
ideal
the gym or the fitness ideal. But it's more like that's variations, right? So sometimes we have to do that, but other times we have to really taste, for example, or feel each other before we can fight, or before we can so his idea is then that of metamorphosis, so that we learn different kinds of dealing with nature, dealing with each other, for example. So sometimes listening, other times fighting, other times so that is developing the variational skills of our body, for example. And so there is not one prototype. So, and that is also coming. So we are not farmers anymore. So that is also with his societal view comes into develop. So our bodies become differentiated. So they are not skilled for a certain type of labor, for example. So he gives also always the example of the hand that you can play piano with, for example, but you can beat someone, you can give someone a hand. So there's not a certain it's not an organ directed at a sort of certain task, but we have to find these tasks themselves and develop multiple ways of dealing with our body in according to nature. Yeah.
So it seems to relate as well to Gert Pista's philosophy of education. In a previous episode, I interviewed him, and he uses his book is also called World-Centered Education, and he also talks about the goal of education is not to, we are going to write down all the skills and knowledge what you need, and that's it, and we fix it. And if you have that knowledge, you can function. Because that's that's the idea of how to function in society and be a productive citizen and all that. But he's using the language of, no, once you finish your education, the world can make an appeal on you. And the world also comes in uninvited and unexpected.
Absolutely.
And how do you respond to that? And that's a different focus, because you cannot decide in advance. Especially in the context of climate, education is so very important, because we don't know the students now. We don't know what the world is going to ask from them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great. So great example. So this is also Serres' idea of education, that you have to learn to deal with noise, with complexities, with detours, with deviations, so unexpected situations, and that concerns far more than than only learning one sport, for example. But so transforming your senses in that sense, and learning how to be responsive to a kind of state, that the world now has.
So in the previous episode, I did a little intro about justice and Plato, where, the prisoner goes out from the cave. We could say like he's dragged upwards, so not by a cord, but he's kind of climbing upwards as well. But then he descends back into the cave as well. And then Plato kind of describes what is it like for someone who have been there, have a different vision, maybe also have a connection with nature. I'm just interpreting. And coming back into society again. And then he says it's very strange for this person if this person has to defend themselves in court, because they have seen kind of the true form, the true idea of justice. But the judge and the other lawyers, they have only seen the shadows of justice. So in the previous episode, we were also speaking about, what for sure rights of nature would be part of this truer form of justice, because our current conception of justice is limited to human rights, animals' rights, children's rights, and all that stuff. But so we're in nature also the natural contract also needs to be involved in that. So I'm wondering, could you explain if Socrates would ask Serres, so what is justice according to you? Do you know what he kind of would his answer consist of?
So the short answer is sort of connection, right? So that is connection with the world and with other people. So that wouldn't be inscribed in a certain law, but and then so limit is parasitism. But so he is in his book he in the Contract of Nature he have a sort of reflection on justice as well. So for example, he relates to Aristotle, and then there Aristotle considers justice as a sort of as a balance or as an equilibrium. So for example, between the person and the cosmos, for example. So this is like a
two-way street.
A scale,
But in order to have that skill, if in slavery, there was parasitism of human beings on other human beings, because these other human beings were not recognized as subjects at all, not even legal subjects as well, but they were just considered objects. So I guess he's saying that in order to have this justice and two-way street, that means also this other factor also needs to be a subject or a...
Yes. Absolutely, kind of, but also, so, and then he's talking about Leibniz's idea of justice. So Leibniz's idea of balance. And then it's more like the statistics of the variable. So then that is taking into account all kinds of sort of varieties. So not only of persons, but also of nature, for example, of technology. And this implies also a sort of stability that is always moving, right? So that's taking account, constantly rewriting our chords with others. And that's then the idea. So that the balance is not certainly there. It's not a sort of equilibrium, but it's sort of like flowing together with others, right? So how can we flow with others so for example, ecosystems remain to have a certain amount of freedom in their development, for example. So this is more like a dynamic perspective, or more like a fluent, turbulent perspective on justice, right? So
So you keep coming back to this, what you said before as well, that like in climate justice and climate law, we don't need like just rigid laws, but and it relates very much to something that Jessica wrote in her book as well. So she's busy with trying to make the Waddense a legal person, but she's emphasizing that. So one of the concerns that people have is that, for instance, the Waddense can sue, I don't know, Shell or somebody. But she's saying, and actually this is a very martial arts kind of thing to say, where you say you learn martial arts not in order to start getting into fights, but actually to avoid getting into fights. So one of the important things about rights of nature is not that we're going to have all these lawsuits, but actually that there will be dialogues and mediation and like round tables and conversation partners. And then, of course, you also have, as a last resort, you also have the courtroom, but it's not the final purpose.
I would say the courtroom would be the final case, but also, and then the boardrooms, but along down the pyramid, I would say there's also a bit of our conduct, right? So this is also a negotiation with nature. And so there the contract is already taking form. So for example, farmers that are plowing, for example, or are harrowing, so they are inscribing their conduct into the planet. This is already signing the planning, so signing the natural contract. So these are prototypical stages for get an idea of what the natural contract would be, and therefore physical education would be very important. So what kind of technologies do we use? How do we use them? What kind of variations? And there's also way of being non-dependent on certain sources, for example, like the gas industry or the oil industry, for example, but finding a way of dissipating energy ourselves, right? So other ways of variations, and also developing then therefore a certain freedom into that.
So finally, I thought I want. I want to share one insight and read a little bit from Serres, because I think, we should let him speak as well. And then I'll give you the final word to, say whatever you want to say in closing. So one of the insights is because I'm writing a book about Plato's cave, and I'm also using the Odyssey there. And the Odyssey is a story written by Homer in which Odysseus goes to fight the, Trojan War, but then he leaves his house. They go in a ship and they come back and after the war, but actually many things happen and it takes them a long time to get back. And the Odyssey is about all the adventures of Odysseus.
Yes.
But then he comes back after 7 years, but then, someone is sitting in his chairs, someone married his wife and everything. So it's like nice for Plato's cave, because you go somewhere and you come back, but you're not recognized anymore, and how to deal with that. And the other famous Greek story is the Iliad. I don't know how to pronounce it in English. I think the Iliad.
The Iliad.
Yeah, which is about the Trojan War, and it's like how the fighting, it centers a lot on Achilles, and Achilles is fighting, but also Achilles has a tent because there's a camp, and Achilles can go to war, but then he can also come back into his tent to sit there and to reflect. So my insight was about when Serres says he says somewhere in the beginning of the book already, being there is getting rarer. And he's saying, on this ship, you have people on the ship know that you need all these strict rules, because if you're fighting together, the ship is going to sink. But
Yes.
at the same time, you don't have he literally says you don't have a place to pitch your tent. So you don't have a place for reflection, how I make it, and mindfulness and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So there's one insight, and I just read the part which is towards the end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
If the mountain finally turns out to be difficult, appallingly tough, then the contract itself takes on a different function. It no longer binds just the mountaineers amongst themselves, but in addition anchors itself to the rock face at specific strong points. The group finds itself bound and submitted not only to itself, but to the objective world. The python is an appeal to the strength of the cliff, which must be tested before any bond can be made to depend on it. A natural contract joins the social contract. These craft casting off, so he's talking about vessels, boats, spacecrafts, and rogue parties. They represent the sum of relations that groups must have with the world. When the world, for those who have cast off, is a dangerous one, what relations do these crafts in turn maintain with law?
Yeah, great. It's beautiful. And so, So now I have to say something after Serres. Yeah. So the relation with the Odyssey is very. So he takes the Odyssey as a sort of metaphor, also with dealing with. So a lot of philosophy would be based on getting a certain ground, so a kind of fundamental for our conduct. So kind of founding, right? So looking for a kind of founding for our behavior, or for what we should do, or for what moral law should we follow, for example. So that is not so. Serres' metaphor of seafaring and of mountain climbing is to reevaluate this kind of philosophy. So there is actually no ground. It's a kind of anti-foundationalist philosophy. You can pick everything as a sort of ground. So that is very hard to find a sort of foundation for our conduct, for example. And that can also change. So what for example, the foundation of our conduct was 100 years ago, it was the plot of the land that we had, for example. Now it's becoming the earth. So, but the earth is also not just one single point. It consists of multiple layers, multiple developments taking into place. And so this idea of this image of casting off, so from the land to the sea, for example, which is and not being anchored, is also would also lead, for example, for Serres to a certain reflection that we don't know what the future will be, that it is improbable, and that but we should deal with the planet and the spaceship Earth, so to say, and with each other in finding conducts to seafair actually. And to find our way into that. So without having an idea of what would be the best to do here, or what would be wrong to do here, but that is always a negotiation, and depending on how the court is being tied to the specific objects, that we deal with. I hope this is a bit of clarification.
It's becoming very clear. Yeah, thank you so much, because I think this is such an important book, and I hope our talk also mainly makes people want to read the book. It's maybe a little bit challenging if you don't have a background in philosophy, but there are also like a lot of stories in there, a lot of images. I think you and I can agree that I have a contract that we advise people to read this book, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's also literal. It's beautifully written, and it combines the natural sciences with law, with social contracts.
Well, thank you so much.